there an audience, John? There's an audience. Imagine what it'd be like with the lights come on. I want to welcome you all to the inaugural lecture of Professor John Hutnik. The invitation which you'll have all received tells us that John is Professor of Cultural Studies, and that's a position to which he was promoted last year. Yet his home discipline is anthropology, where he initially built his reputation, where it remains a very strong reputation, as I know. And that route from anthropology to cultural studies really shapes his work. It shapes its character, and it shapes so much of its trajectory. We can see that in the character of John's cultural studies work. Some people in cultural studies start from theory and move on to cultural objects. For John, the cultural artifact is his starting point. It's from sensibility to that cultural artifact that theory, for him, engages. And this is visible in John's work as it moves from tourism to music and on to exotica and trinketization and beyond then to television. In all of these, it's concrete cultural things that matter to John. And to find it, he'll go not to a country's most fashionable cities, but to Nagoya in Japan or Detroit or Calcutta, the more ordinary working cities where he finds his material. And there his fieldwork and his attention to the artifacts of culture flourish. To an outside observer, this is a cultural studies that relates to his anthropology. As a very distinguished British anthropologist observed, John's writing ranges across the interdisciplinary synergies that bind anthropology and cultural studies. And we can see it also in his concern to change anthropology in the UK. Somehow, might be put to modernise it, through his work on travel and music, film and politics, to have an influence on the discipline of anthropology. And in this, he engaged with other trends in the Goldsmiths Department of Anthropology. Most notably, it's now very major strands of work in cultural politics and in visual anthropology. John came to Goldsmiths in 1998 from the Anthropology Department at Manchester. And it was the Anthropology Department here at Goldsmiths that he joined. But over time, he also began working with the growing Centre for Cultural Studies. And it was to there that he was increasingly drawn. He was seconded to the centre half-time in 2003, and in 2006 he moved there full-time. A cross-disciplinary place like the Centre for Cultural Studies seems right for John. One of his driving projects through his work has been to create a real interdisciplinarity. It's difficult in many ways to undertake interdisciplinary teaching and research, especially to do so without diluting what one might call its substantive content. And John has mastered and overcome this challenge. And even more important, I think, he's developing students, working with students to do the same thing. John and Scott Lash have built a remarkable environment in the centre. And as academic director, John has played a crucial role in that. He does so by the characteristics he brings to all his work. Someone said to me that John stands out, and I quote, on account of his ability to think on his feet and keep the intellectual sparks flying. It's done not with aggression, but in a concern to generate real debate, to act with generosity and wit, to create scope, to create room for dialogue and argument. As one distinguished American anthropologist observed, he builds communities like no other academic I've come across. And John's prodigious intellectual energy is directed at that, to write with others, to debate with them, to create symposia together, and so on. And he brings those skills to the teaching and study in the Centre for Cultural Studies. His commitment to the project that is the Centre for Cultural Studies is enormous, and it's shown in his engagement with the Centre's students. These are all MA and research students. The Centre does not teach undergraduate programmes. They're part of the intellectual community that John seeks to energise. And he does so through a passionate commitment to that engagement. The students in the centre really matter to him, and it shows, not just by the amount of time he gives to working with them, though that's a lot, and not just by the very large number of PhD students whom John supervises, but also by his huge commitment to the excellence, to the curriculum development, and the rest of the things that make the centre so successful. He's played a key role in the expansion of the centre in recent years, in practical aspects of the centre's work as academic director, but also as one of its intellectual driving forces. Did John's career necessarily end up in cultural studies at Goldsmiths? I'm a historian, and I know that hindsight creates a sense of inevitability that is generally illusory. There were all kinds of routes that John could have followed after obtaining his BA in anthropology at Deakin University and a PhD in political science at Melbourne. At about that time, John left Australia, where he's kept active personal and academic links since, and came to Manchester in 1994 as a postdoctoral research fellow, working on South Asian youth culture, and then as a lecturer in the Department of Social Anthropology at Manchester, which he left in 1998 to come to Goldsmiths. And here, I'm really pleased to say, he has stayed. Stayed in one sense, but that hasn't prevented him engaging globally. His conference presentations have taken him to places such as Frankfurt and Amsterdam, Singapore, Calcutta, Berlin, Santa Barbara, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Halle, Paris and Tokyo, and to a multitude of UK venues from Brick Lane to the ICA. Although they're not that far apart, I think they are far apart culturally. That global reach has enabled John with Scott to bring to Goldsmiths an astonishing range of intellectual figures. To quote another leader in the field, to be invited by the Centre for Cultural Studies has become a mark of international recognition. And the paths of all this academic activity have been marked by publication. His first big book was The Rumour of Calcutta, published in 1996, which John gave me to read on the plane to India when I went 2 weeks ago, and of course I was too busy working on other things. It will be read on my return. It's an ethnographic study based on fieldwork. It's an ethnographic study based on fieldwork with expatriates, tourists, visitors. It was an enormously innovative book at the time, and remains so, with ideas that became central to urban anthropology and globalization debates, and it remains a much-cited text. His work then moved on to South Asian diasporic cultural production in the UK, part of a larger trend critical of conventional studies of migration. He helped shape a new agenda for studying settlement in Britain, and his organisational work in this area bore early fruits in a book he edited in 1996 called Disorienting Rhythms, The Politics of the New Asian Dance Music, and it was followed in 2000 by his monograph Critique of Exotica, Music, Politics and the Culture Industry. Other books followed. In 2004, Bad Marxism, Capitalism and Cultural Studies. In 2005, a co-authored work on hybridity and diaspora. And in 2006, a jointly edited collection on the anthropological method called Celebrating Transgression. And to these, one must add over a dozen book contributions, half a dozen edited special issues of journals, and over 30 refereed journal articles. John's current work breaks new ground in studies of material culture, exploring souvenirs and other trinkets, which allowed him to coin the term trinketization, while continuing his ongoing interest with readings of global television and cinema as politics. Much of John's latest work you'll read about on his blog, as you'll learn about the debate launched on the future shape of research in the Centre for Cultural Studies. What should the CCS be like in the future? What should it do? And he launched it under the typically provocative title, Attack the Headquarters. This is not some trivial blog, though I'm sure that John would challenge me and ask what's wrong with trivia. It's a major intervention in anthropology and in cultural studies. And one must ask, how has he time for it all? And will the birth of Emile, just a month or so ago, hold him back? I hope it'll hold him back, because his delight in Emile is evident, and he has to have time to enjoy him. John's blog links us to hundreds of photos of Emile on Flickr. And he is very beautiful. Emile, that is. But I can't see John ceasing to be a dynamic, vibrant force at Goldsmiths. Anyone joining Goldsmiths finds out just how important John is to the place. Does he express its inner soul? Of course not. No one does that. But he does bring a distinctive, intellectually subversive, engaged commitment that is one fundamental feature of Goldsmiths. I'm therefore very pleased to invite John Hotnick to deliver his inaugural lecture, Pantomime Terror, the Paranoid Commuter and the Danger of Music. John.
I mean, I was the only one who had to do it in the dark.
Yeah. I'm in semi-darkness, which is so that you can see Rosh and Seth. Thank you for that, Jeff. That's fantastic. I've got a number of thank yous to make, which is standard for these kind of events, I'm afraid. Well, pleased to say, you only have to do them once. All right? The light, you won't be able to see Rosh and Seth then. That's the deal with this. I'm going to walk around a little bit, but I want to thank quickly Emile and Tara, of course, and Grandma Gay, who's got Emile at present, and Cheryl, who came. My sister Cheryl's come over from Melbourne for this. Thanks for coming. I want to thank a guy called Stephen Walker, who tricked me into going back into school from the Community Youth Support Scheme in Tacoma in Australia. Nikos Papastergiadis, who tricked me into coming to England. Sanjay, Ash, Verinda and Raminda, who gave me something to do while I was here. Steve Nugent, who tricked me into coming to Goldsmiths. Your fault, Steve. Thank you. Malcolm Crick, who tricked me into anthropology. Peter Kirping, who kept me going. And the Department of Anthropology, of course, here, and the Centre for Cultural Studies. Julian, Ayal, Janice, everyone who's come here, everyone who's a colleague. Chris, Carrie, Richard, Leah, Atticus, Jeff and Tom for helping teaching be so fun, and all of my students, but especially the much missed. There's three who are much missed who would have been here, and they are Paul Hendrick, Ro Wright, and Imogen Bunting. And I really wish they would have been here. I know they would have been, and they're much missed. So I want to stand. The dedication is to those three, but I want Rosh and Seth to stand for the figure of dedication to everyone, because he is the epitome of what I'm going to call the pantomime performer. Once upon a long ago, far away a time, Ross and Seth was in a film called My Beautiful Laundrette. Do you remember this film? Yeah. This is the first event that I ever organised as an academic. I put on this film in 1985. It was the first time this film was screened in Australia, and it has the usual controversies. There's this. Omar, the figure who starts the laundrette, kisses a white boy who's a fascist, and this caused a lot of controversy. But my reason for mentioning this at the start is I want to remember the figure of Rosh and Seth from this film, the figure that he played. He was vodka-addled, bedridden, former socialist journalist, who sat in his bed throughout the film kind of denouncing the world and bemoaning the state of things in Thatcher-era Britain. And I think that figure is an interesting one that I want to hang on to. Rosh and Seth was in a number of other of Hanif Qureshi's films. He was in The Buddha of Suburbia. He was in London Kills Me. But it's Hanif Qureshi's stuff, book My Son the Fanatic, that I want to remember at the beginning as well. Because there, in that book somewhere, he mentions that the book 1001 Nights, otherwise known as Arabian Nights, the first book I ever got as a present, was the greatest story ever told. Now that might be hyperbole and so on, but I'm very interested that he said that. But Seth was in a number of other films. I'm going to stick with him for a minute. He was in Gandhi. Do you remember Gandhi, Richard Attenborough's film? This is about the same time as My Beautiful Laundrette. And here is Ben Kingsley, who's playing Gandhi. I don't have a picture of Seth, who was Nehru in the film, right? The Prime Minister, socialist, first Prime Minister of India. There's a bit of just an anecdote I can tell about this poster here. There was a controversy around the making of Gandhi. Well, there were many controversies around the making of the film Gandhi when Attenborough made the film. One of them was that Hindu supporters of Gandhi suggested that it was not possible for someone to represent the great spirit that was Gandhi on screen. And in the film, really, there should be just a white light passing across the frame to represent the spirit, the soul, the great soul that is the Mahatma. Attenborough's obviously tried to get this effect in this film with Kingsley there in white in this background, which is interesting. Pakistanis, there was an academic at Cambridge I once heard talk about how important that film was and how necessary it was for Pakistan to have an equivalent film about the other founder of the South Asian polity, Pakistan, the nation of Pakistan, Jinnah. And when I first came to England, I went to a weird dinner once in Rusholme in Manchester. I was £1,000 a head. I was the anthropologist, so I didn't have to pay £1,000, thankfully, which was to raise money to put on this film about the life of Jinnah. And it was going to be, the antidote, or the competitor, the equivalent of Attenborough's Gandhi. But, they weren't going to make any critical comments about the Hindus and so on. They were going to show that Nehru was sleeping with Edwina Mountbatten, but they weren't going to make any political mileage out of that. And they needed to raise money for this film, and they needed to get an actor to play Jinnah. And the person at this dinner that was being suggested was Ben Kingsley. It would be fantastic if that was possible. In the end, they got Christopher Lee, which wasn't necessarily the best choice, and the film, which came out in 1997, wasn't necessarily the best film. But anyway, Russian Seth was always in some really great films, but he was also in some pretty sad films. And this one, which is about the Thuggee cult, which I've written about in Rumour of Calcutta. The Thuggee cult, they used to put a rupee coin, trinkets, a rupee coin in a scarf and wrap that around their victim's neck and throttle them. In Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which is where this cult is allegedly set. This is absolutely exotic. Russian Seth played, guess what? The Prime Minister of India. But this time his name was Chatalal. Okay, the red reference there. I don't actually have a picture of him either. But just to emphasise how orientalist and exoticist this particular film was, here I have Amrish Puri, who played the part of the cult leader, Mola Ram. And here he's got the pulsating heart that is just ripped out of some poor victim's chest. So Russian Seth has had this great career. Okay? Some highlights, he also played Beria, the head of the NKVD in the film Stalin. What I want to stress, what Russian Seth gives me, just to start off with, is that he's into dress up. He's a pantomime figure. He's dressed up in all these different roles. But even though I'm going to talk about pantomime, I wish I'd have dressed like Julian here, who's one of our very own alumni. In a pantomime role. Here he's playing Aladdin's sidekick, Dandini. I mean, this is the role that he has made his own in pantomime. And I want to talk about pantomime quite a bit. In pantomime, you get these outfits, fantastic outfits, and there's lots of interesting character roles, and in a pantomime you can play several different characters. There's role reversal for people in pantomime. There's cross-dressing and gender ambiguities and so on. There's a whole lot of myths or rituals or routines that are traditional in pantomime. For example, the bad guys come from the left of the stage, of course, and the fairies come on from the right, traditionally. There's slapstick, there's a kind of burlesque aspect, there's fairy princesses, there's always a knowing moral to the story, and it's for all the family, right? And the key figure used to be the harlequin and became the clown. There's kind of a trickster figure. And I think that's quite an important way in which I can then think about pantomime as a metaphor, as a way of thinking about contemporary events that I want to talk about when we get to Fundamental and the War on Terror. There is a long pop tradition of pop personas and celebrities performing in pantomime. Now, pantomime is this Christmas tradition. It goes back to Commedia dell'arte and a whole range of different theatrical forms that I could go on for a while about, but I won't. I'm keen to look at contemporary pantomimes and how they they kind of condense. I want to suggest that they can be read as a kind of allegory of the contemporary, or we can read into the way in which they respond to contemporary events, a kind of diagnosis of our times. And this is a bit ambitious, but you know. Pop personas in pantomime. Tommy Steele, going back to the early days, Cliff Richard, the shadows were wishy-washy, noshy and nishy or something. I don't know if people go that far back. The Spice Girls have been in pantomime. Russell Brand, he's not a pop star, is he? Wants to be, can't sing. Johnny Depp, I know he's a pirate, but it's kind of pantomime, isn't it? Especially when when Keith Richard becomes his dad in the previous or the last in the series. Pantomime is very often something that can make comments on the contemporary, and that's what I want to get hold of tonight. I've seen pantomimes in the last 2 years. I'm preparing for fatherhood. You go and see pantomimes, and you think about, what are you going to do with the kids? Pantomimes are about getting to the kids. Get them early, teach them stuff, teach them the ideology. I've seen Snow White, in which there was an appearance of Saddam Hussein. He was found down a hole in a cave. Okay? Clearly, I've seen a pantomime, this is about 1.5 years ago, which was Dick Whittington, you know the guy who becomes thrice mayor of London, and he has a cat. And this was a commentary on Red Ken and Boffin Boris. Blonde bombshell. Dick Whittington's story, of course, he becomes thrice mayor and so on. But one part of it that struck me, that stood out, was that he makes his money in a financial scam in the Orient. He's a banker, does very well out of that, has electoral success, and then comes to rule the city. There are some who may like to pay more attention to that. What I wanted to get to is to say that pantomime might be used as a metaphor for thinking about the contemporary political conjuncture. All right, you might have 9/11 fatigue. Saddam Hussein's being mocked. It's become a comedy, and Iraq and Al Qaeda and wherever they are and so on. But I'm prepared to follow Gagi Bhattacharya, who wrote a really great book recently called Dangerous Brown Men. And she argues that there's a cultural project that goes along with the war on terror, that infiltrates through or filters through into all of our cultural production, and including pantomime. So I want to think about this. Now I remember that Qureshi had said something about 1001 Nights, and I got really interested in what the 1001 Nights stands for, because it is the main repository of stories for pantomime. So many pantomime stories come from that archive that is the 1001 Nights. Okay, you know them. Aladdin and his magic opium lamp. Sinbad the sailor and his open sesame cave over in Tora Bora. And Ali Baba and the 40 oil thieves. Get them while they're young. Pantomime teaches Orientalist ideology and teaches it to kids. Just what we need. Cinderella is from the circuit as well, and several others. Now, of course, there are dangers in using a kind of theatrical metaphor, and especially this kind of lowbrow one for thinking about hard politics. But I kind of want to take pantomime a little bit more seriously and take the clown figure more seriously. Aside, it's quite useful allegorical frame. So I also want to talk about Aki Nawaz from Fundamental, as I always do. Aki Nawaz, I've been working with him and his stuff for about 15 years, and here he is from 15 years ago, from the album Seize the Time, on stage, doing his Aki thing, aggressive, in-your-face, punkster. Well, he used to be the drummer in the band Southern Death Cult. He then started Nation Records and became the leader of Fundamental, putting the fun back into fundamentalism. And the mental as well, because it's a thoughtful project. And he's there. He spent a lot of time, he played the figure of Propagandhi. Right? And that was his pantomime character, if you like, when he was in the band at this stage. And always covered his good looks, with this scarf, a keffiyeh, which was the scarf of Palestinian solidarity for a very long time, and has now become something you can buy in American Apparel and Gap and so on. There's a great blog by an anthropologist called Ted Swedenborg called Hall Blog. If you check that out, from 1995 he's been tracking appearances of keffiyeh in pop stars. Anyway, that's where I'm. Aki, I don't want to get into some big world music scenario, and again, there's a lot of things to be said about Aki Nawaz and fundamental, but I just want to pay attention a little bit to this headscarf, since that's the topical thing post September 11, and Aki's sense of presentation of self. I'd forgotten actually that I included this slide. I wasn't going to talk about this one where he does the whole, we're British, Asian, English thing, so I'm just going to flip over that, right? And get to this one, which I really wanted to talk about. This is a photograph that was in the Guardian newspaper, that paper of record. I particularly love the Guardian. It's especially when the Iraq war was about to start. Do you remember? You'd open page 1 and 2, and it'd be a full-page double-spread map of Iraq with little explosions where they were going to bomb things, or they had bombed things. I wrote in and said that they should provide a little plastic container full of toy soldiers attached to the front so we can push them around. Anyway, the Guardian's going to be something I want to get. I think a campaigning newspaper is an important part of our culture, but the Guardian sometimes lets us down. And it did here when it talked about Aki Nawaz. Now, this is 2006. So I've left out, 3/4 of Aki's career. He organised a global sweatbox rather than a global jukebox, sort of like a global jukebox with Edge. Brought over a lot of musicians to Britain, prophets of the city, Qawwali singers like Aziz Mian, got involved in a lot of political projects and sponsored or fostered a lot of other bands that you know of, like Asian Dub Foundation and so on, through the Nation label. But in 2006, they were about to release an album called All Is War, The Benefits of Jihad. It was a joke about gangsters, right? Gangster rap and so on. Somebody who was once at this college called them the Asian public enemy. Fundamental. I think that's kind of an error, but they'll take it. All Is War, 2006. Aki does this publicity photograph. Actually, this is the pantomime part. This is the audience participation part of the pantomime. What I want to get people to do is tell me what you can see in the picture. Just shout anything out.
A bus.
A bus? Sorry, that bro.
Yeah.
That's unusual. Everyone spots that one.
Shell suit.
Where's the shell suit?
Rucksack.
St. George's flag.
Okay, we'll start with the St. George's flag. We might as well start there. Right, I've got to put some context. It's important to put context. This is 2006, right? So there was a football, we call it soccer, football event happening at the time in around, and there was flags up, and things weren't doing so well. And this guy, this likely lad, had obviously put the flag there. I want you to pay attention to how the photograph by Martin Goodwin has been set up as an ensemble. We've got on this side, on the right of the picture, if you like, this guy who's a likely looking lad with his. Do you see that? Actually, they've had to. Goodwin's construction of the photograph has been modified in the editorial process. You see, they've had to put this little caption over it. If you look, he's holding a lead, and what he had was a bulldog. It was just like that was one cliche too far. So they covered that up. But anyway, yeah. Then we've got on the other side we've got a bus and a backpack, and we've got Aki in his Roma shirt. And Aki's done a lot of anti-racist work, anti-imperialist, anti-racist campaigning is his thing. The Roma shirt, we can read that in a couple of different ways. Yes, it's a football reference, but Roma is, they're the more progressive side in the two Rome teams. And I want to look at where his headscarf is. He's wearing the headscarf on his head now. Quite often, the thing about Palestinian solidarity is scarves, and all through the 70s and 80s, when people wore them, they wore them as scarves. Aki's making a kind of two-camera gesture that he's with the people who wear headscarves. And of course, it's a kind of punky to camera look, isn't it? The first time I interviewed him, he was dribbling, right? just to outrage me, just to shock and provoke. And I like how he does that. And again, it's from the Andrew Loog Oldham School of banned publicity, right? Any publicity is good publicity. Confront the camera, look angry, and so on. I think Goodwin and he have collaborated in setting up this ensemble. But I'm not sure that Aki anticipated just what kind of contextualization would happen. The bus, the backpacker on the other side. The article was called Aki Nawaz, suicide rapper, likens bin Laden to Che Guevara. The suicide rapper, ladies and gentlemen. The suicide rapper. I think that's a great, scary term. And yeah, of course, the suicide rapper thing suggests that the bus and the backpack are not accidental in the ensemble set up by Goodwin. It's not accidental at all. July 3, this was 2006. 1 year after, and a couple of days before, July 7, 2005. The much written about 7/7. I think this visual proximity that links Aki with the bus is something that he didn't anticipate. That Goodwin and The Guardian have set up, they've collaborated in setting this up. And it references certain kinds of commuter fears. Yeah, 7/7. Horrific details, and the bus, especially that Tavistock Square bus. The bus is a globally acknowledged symbol of London, right? You can even see it in the Bird's Nest Stadium in China. But that particular bus, 56 people dead, horrific events. Not 56 on the bus, but on that day, 56 dead. And of course, another major event is thereby communicated to us, telegraphed, 9/11, and all the discussion there. There's been a lot of academic discussion about these events, of course. Right? Derrida talks about the pervertibility of these images. There's a lot of discussion of the way in which, well, I went and read a few of the major theorists who talk about those events, 9/11 and 7/7, and I saw a kind of curious, what I find a curious continuity. There seems to be repetition anxiety in talking about 7/7. One thing people really often do in the texts that I've read is tell us where they were and that thing happened. It used to be when JFK was shot. Now it's where were you in 9/11? Where did you first see it? Which part of London were you wandering through? Okay, fair enough. I'm not going to tell you where I am. Well, I was. But that's interesting. But the other thing that's a continuity, and I found it in the work of Slavoj Žižek, Susan Buck-Morss, and Elaine Badiou. And I actually started thinking about pantomime because of Elaine Badiou. He talks about theatre as being good for acting out ideas. In a book that was helpfully translated by Alberto. Thank you. Žižek talks about how the 7/7 bombers left no list of demands. Susan Buck-Morss says that the 9/11 bombing was a mute act. A mute act. There was no demand. They left no message. The message was somehow in the media sphere. It was the event. Derrida then says this is not understandable. This is something. Žižek talks about this image, 7/7 or 9/11 being pervertible, and being in fact a perverse eruption of jouissance into the public. There was no message. The Jew has the same. He says somewhere in his polemics book, they left no demands. They made no demands. Derrida says the scary thing about the bombers, the suicide bombers, I'm not talking about suicide rappers now, I'm talking about suicide bombers. Suicide bombers were prepared to lose their lives, and that's what was really scary. I'm interested in that. I think it's not quite. I think there's a silencing in the commentaries that allow us to stop at that point and say they left no demands, there was no message, or the message was in the message sphere or something. And avoid somehow the intentionality or the motives of the people who did the bombings. Aki wants us to think differently about this. And the album All Is War is an attempt to address thinking about that, to make us, to force us to think more closely and carefully about what it is that makes youth in Britain, British Asian youth or anyone, want to commit such acts. To call them, Zizek calls the event a blind act. Mute, blind, and silent. And I think it was an enormous murder, lengthily premeditated, and yet silent. No one claimed responsibility. And Susan Buck-Morss, in a otherwise really good book, an interesting book she writes called Thinking Past Terror in 2003. What she does, she goes and she says, well, I've not read any Islamic scholars, I'll go and do it. Admirable. She then says that this act is mute because they left no list of demands. But at one point she does have this little bracketed clause that says, or did they? Particularly interested in that. Because of this image. Now, there has been the beginnings of a sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies work on trying to comprehend the suicide bomber. And a lot of it is happening here at Goldsmiths. There's Back's great book, The Art of Listening. Vivek Seidler has a book. And Gargi Bhattacharya, who comes here often, has a commentary on understanding, attempting to understand the suicide bomber. I've got slight differences with all of those, but I think that's an important work. And Gayatri Spivak, I think, kicks it off. She's very interesting, and she lines up along with Les and Vic in some ways, and saying what we need to do is not rush to judgment. It doesn't mean it's endorsing, but not rush to judgment before you understand and comprehend. Try to understand, try to comprehend through a kind of, an impossible work of empathy. I find that troubling, but what do you need to do? What kind of position do you need to be in? Can we put our heads in a place that allows you to commit an atrocity like that? Yeah, all right. There's some gory stuff, but I want to read this scene a bit more carefully. In particular, I want to read some of the weird ironies and even more disturbing parts of it. Do you see the sign on the side of the bus? One of the things Gayatri Spivak teaches us to do is to read really carefully, to put things into context, to read, to learn to read, to unlearn the ways in which we read into context that we already have, to try and break down then context, to try and hone our skills of reading by looking up lexicons, by learning from participants, and learning to read what's there in the real and in the world. So I want to take seriously that for a minute and read what's on the side of the bus, and it spins me out. Do you remember that this was on the side of the bus? This image has kind of disappeared from the text. We don't see it anymore in images of the bus. You see a front-on shot. You don't often see this, which was an advertisement for a film called The Descent, which is kind of a terrible film, I don't recommend it, about some people who go down into a cave and there's some kind of monster in there that slowly picks them up, picks them off and kills them, and eventually everyone dies, or maybe one person. I have to confess I was kind of nodding off towards the end of the film. But the banner for it, it was to be released the next day, the banner for it was on the side of many buses in London. And this is not a photograph of the bus. You can see this is a couple of days later. I went out and took the photograph. But it says outright terror, bold and brilliant. I'm not saying that Mir Hussein, the bomber in Tavistock Square, intended us to get this message. And I'm not conspiracy theorising and so, maybe Lex for a little bit think, well, maybe he intended that. Vic says that this bombing, the bus bombing, was unplanned. But maybe he just saw this. We don't know. I mean, the suicide bomber by what's the word? Default is dead if they succeed. And you can't interview them, you can't ask them to think what they might have been thinking. Can we do that? But I find it a little bit disturbing to even try to do that. But I wonder what's going through someone's mind. But I'm also intrigued that this image has disappeared from the record. We don't see it anymore. We rarely see it. If you see anything from the bus at all, it's this front-on shot. This is a front-on shot from an article just a month ago where MI5, bless their cotton socks, told us, or through a leaked document, that not all terrorists are Muslims. It took us how many years to work this out? In fact, Muslims might be, like in the other part of the British population, the ones who, well, according to The Guardian, it could be Muslims or others. In fact, when you look at the MI5 report, it just says there is no demographic. There is no single group that provides us with our bombers and terrorists. In fact, it could be anyone. It could be, it's more likely to be someone born, grown up in Britain, to have citizenship. It's more likely to be, well, it could be any one of us. It could be you. It could be me. Right? It could be the person sitting next to you on the bus. And this is where I start to think about panto again. The big thing about pantomime, we go back to the presentation of Aki. Right? What happens? What's the bit that really interpolates kids into the presentation of 1001 Nights and Aladdin and Sinbad and so on, is when the bad guy, who's come from the left, sneaks up on the hero, and all the kids have to say, you're supposed to say it, look out, he's behind you, right? And then we all feel reassured because we've saved the day and things can go, well, look out, the bus is behind Aki. But Aki is the suicide bomber, the suicide rapper. And another reason why I want to understand this scenario and this one, the MI5 briefing note on how we all may well be violent, extreme, anger, rejection, all those things may be part of our makeup in contemporary Britain, is there's something in the Scheherazade story, the framing, the story of the 1001 Nights, that gives me a way to unfold, at least might give us a way to unfold a kind of politics in this. I take my cue here from an essay by Walter Benjamin, of all people, the Marxist you can take home to meet your mum. He's the one who wrote the essay The Storyteller in 1936. The Storyteller is a great essay. I mean, I probably should have told you about Vladimir Pop and Svetlana Todorov and Claude Levi-Strauss, who's going to be 100 years old in a month. Still kicking. Because all of that will tell you a lot of stuff about fairy tales and pantomime and myths and drama. But in The Storyteller, Benjamin addresses fairy tales. He addresses magic. He addresses a whole range of different things. Macbeth, Marxism, buying books, reading books, teaching, tall tales, and so on. But he also laments. He laments the loss, the decline of the storyteller. And how the storyteller was had a really important role in making us think again, think differently. The storyteller would give us things to think, to change the way we think. It's sort of a paraphrased quote from Foucault as well, isn't it? He says, what's the point of thinking at all if you don't think differently? I think Goldsmith's strapline, transforming experience, is not what we mean here. But it is what we mean here, sorry. In the new branded version, I remember the finance officer spinning that quite well. Spinning that one in a quite different way. In joke, sorry, just a few asides. Right? In that essay, The Storyteller, Benjamin mentions Scheherazade 3 times, which is interesting. And she gets mentioned by lots of other figures. Jacques Lacan talks about her in an interesting way. He says that the interesting thing about the Scheherazade framing story, you know what the story is, right? She's the 3,001st wife of a despotic king called Shah Jahan, who has been taking a new wife every night. They have nuptials in the palace or whatever, and in the morning she's beheaded or killed. And Scheherazade volunteers to enter into this scene and tells Shah Jahan a story. Aladdin, Sinbad, Cinderella, but never finishes it come morning. I was going to say dawn, but I can't imagine that really works, because Shah Jahan has to go and then deal with matters of state, and nobody does that early in the morning. So anyway, you know that Scheherazade then lives to tell a story the next night, finish the story off the next night, and continues with another story, and on it goes. Yeah? Lacan says this is interesting because it's a big gamble. And yes, it is, think about it. It's a really big gamble. And it's a gamble that means storytelling must be tight, detailed, interesting, and well-timed. In fact, she can't finish too early. And then he mentions Edgar Allan Poe's little short story called The 1002nd Night, where she does finish the story. Don't read it. Kids, don't. It's, ends badly. Anyway, so I want to read into the Scheherazade that we know and love, a kind of political diagnostic, if you think that, if you like, that lines up with Benjamin. A useful kind of storytelling that intervenes in the interests of liberation, in the interests of undoing power. But interestingly, it requires you to and I don't know really where I'm going to end up with this or how we can get out of it. It means you have to end up loving your audience, that is your enemy. She does marry him in the end. They fall in love. Right? Scheherazade and the wicked king, and they live happily ever after, as you do in fairy tales. And I think that complicity, that involvement with power, that compromise, that necessary engagement is something very difficult to work through. Necessary. Aki, wherever he's gone, is called the suicide rapper in the Guardian, and in the Sun, and in the Parliament, and so on. And he's demonised, and he's afraid that he's going to get locked up in detention and so on and so forth. But he doesn't. There's a bit of a campaign prepared in case they do detain him, but instead he gets invited onto Newsnight, and that's, Aki says, is intentionally referencing that Martin Luther King speech. Martin Luther King then was pilloried in Time and Newsweek and journals like that for this. There's lots of other things I want to say about the video, well, I did want to get onto some other videos. I had some, I'm not going to show them now. I had some great grunt videos from Iraq. Have you seen these things? Grunt videos that are coming out of Iraq where, they're like pop promos, but they're made by our soldiers at the front. Okay? So they go with they're on their patrol with their cameras or their mobile phones, and they record travelling through the streets, and they bring it back and put it on YouTube for all of us to see with musical sound, syncopated, queued up sound, using AC/DC's Highway to Hell. Right? For Australia, this is for Cheryl, actually. Although I have seen a version of the Night Vision grunt video, which is done to Marilyn Manson's re-edit of AC/DC's Highway to Hell. And then there's a whole range of different kind of videos that might be put into this. Gagi Bhattacharya does talk really interestingly about some of them in dangerous brown men. But I guess what I want to end with is just my anxiety or my critique is that we can't continue to not discuss the context, the motivations, and the meanings of what's happening to youth in Britain or contemporary Britain in the context of the war on terror, how the war on terror is making us paranoid wherever we go, station announcements and so on and so forth, to look after our... Whose bag is this? I was on a train coming back from the airport, and I bought 2 bottles of whiskey, and I emptied them out because I didn't want the packaging, and put them on the shelf, and put the whiskey in my bag, and a guy came up to me and said, "Those boxes yours?" Well, no, and they're empty. I thought he wanted the whiskey. But he was concerned that there might have been a bomb inside that. This kind of paranoia is part of how I'm not saying there's not terror, and there's not bombings and atrocities every day, but I think we need more than to say that the message is that there's just a jouissance in the media script, or that these are blind acts or mute acts. I think we need to engage with them in a different way. And I think storytelling can perhaps get to us. But then maybe, just for today at least, the allegory of panto can make us think differently about it. To think differently about how we're being encouraged to think that the guy behind you is the danger. He's behind you. And actually, he, Aki, has just run the blockade to Gaza on the boat Free Gaza and got through to past the Israeli Navy to visit Gaza with a bunch of activists. He's behind you. We need to question the kind of people that are writing these documents, like the MI5 briefing note that tells us that we're all potential terrorists. The terrorist could be anyone, which is, a step forward, but still part of the scare story. He's behind you, also writing the counterinsurgency manual, an anthropologist, participating in that, and we've heard interesting discussions about it from a number of anthropologists. And just recently, you'll read, if you check out, is it Anthropology Today, the latest edition? Some of my colleagues will help us out. Where Gustav Haltman has talked about the infiltration of the secret services and so on into teaching programs. He's behind you, driving home through Bakersfield, listening to gospel music on the coloured radio station. The preacher keeps right on telling you that the Lord's always by your side. And, you'd be really pleased to be informed of it and run 20 red lights in his honour. Thank you, Jesus. We can talk about religion, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't fall into the comparative prejudice of... Well, the first course, my first job actually, teaching religion was one of these comparative religion discussions. And they seem to be now everywhere. But it was one that did all religions, according to the professor then, who said, we're going to study all religions equally. We'll study Christianity and compare it to Buddhism, Christianity and compare it to Hinduism, Christianity. All right, we can talk about the context. He's behind you. Well, she's behind you. She's Scheherazade. And I think today, Scheherazade's story is somewhat different. She'll be the one who is in what's called the torture taxi. Have you seen Paglen's book, Torture Taxi, which talks about special rendition and detention? And so she's the one who was arrested in a stop and search, walking down the street here in Britain. Was put into Belmarsh, put into detention. She's behind you. And Scheherazade was then flown to a concentration camp, Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, that lovely piece of land that used to belong to William Randolph Hearst, of all people, and interrogated. The storytelling that Scheherazade does today, 1001 Nights of it, is to the interrogators in Guantanamo. Well, at least I have this scary image. And she's smuggled in a text, a mobile phone, and she's sending desperate SMS messages out to Roshan Seth, socialist journalist, but he's too sozzled from vodka to get out of bed and report them, and we need that report. We need that kind of journalism in The Guardian, not sozzled rants. He's behind us as well. Thank you very much.
lights are on, I can see that this is probably the largest audience for an inaugural lecture that I've seen in my 3 years at Goldsmiths. There may have been bigger ones before, but this really is a packed audience. That's testimony to not the number of friends, but the number of people. Oh my God.